The year was 1878. November. A wind that had traveled over 1,000 miles of frozen plains was now trying to peel the skin from her face. It found the gaps in her threadbare wool coat and filled them with ice. Martha stood at the property line, her boots sinking into the hardening mud of the road. In her left hand, she held a single, heavy book bound in worn leather. Her knuckles were white. The cold was not cruel, it was simply what cold does. It takes heat without asking. Across the splintered fence post, Sheriff Brody sat high on his horse, the animal's breath pluming in the air. He was a man made of straight lines and hard angles, his face set like winter stone. He represented a world that had no more room for her. He looked down, not at her, but at the deed in his gloved hand, as if it were the final word from a distant and unassailable god. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. The law is the law, Martha. A woman can't hold a deed against a debt. His words were not shouted. They were delivered quietly, with the calm finality of a nail being driven into a coffin lid. Martha did not look at him. She did not look at the house she had built with her husband, the smoke still rising faintly from its chimney. Her gaze was fixed on the Torridon peaks, their grey granite shoulders already heavy with the promise of a long and unforgiving winter. Her right hand, hidden in her coat pocket, closed around a small, smooth rock. It was strangely warm to the touch, a secret heat against her frozen skin. It was a piece of the mountain she held, a piece of knowledge nobody else had thought to ask about. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below, as we tell this story. Martha and her husband, Arthur, had never quite fit in the small Wyoming valley. They were not ranchers by birth, but by choice. Arthur had come west for his lungs, a quiet academic from Boston with more books than cattle. Martha had come with him, a woman whose curiosity was as wide as the sky. They bought a small parcel of land that everyone else considered marginal, its soil too thin, its water uncertain. And then they had proceeded to make it flourish in ways that unsettled their neighbors. Their defining habit was reading. While other ranchers were mending fences or driving herds, Arthur and Martha could be found on their porch, heads bent over books shipped at great expense from the east. He read geology, obsessed with the bones of the earth, the language of stone and strata. She read agricultural science, learning of soil composition, crop rotation, and animal husbandry. They kept records. Meticulous, detailed records of rainfall, of milk yields, of weight gain in their small flock of sheep. They talked about things like limestone supplements and genetic lines. This was not how things were done. Ranching was a matter of tradition, of inherited wisdom passed from father to son. It was about hard work and a healthy fear of God, not scientific inquiry. The community saw their quiet success not as admirable, but as a kind of arrogance. It was an unspoken accusation. Their methods suggested that the old ways, the ways of everyone else, were wrong. The rejection was not a single event, but a slow, steady pressure, a current of suspicion that ran beneath the surface of every polite greeting at the general store. Preacher Davis, a man whose faith was as hard and unyielding as the winter ground, gave voice to the valley's discomfort. From his pulpit one Sunday, he spoke of the dangers of worldly knowledge, his eye sweeping over the congregation and resting for just a moment too long on the pew where Martha and Arthur Saturday. Pride in the mind, he had thundered, is a weed in the soul. Trust the sweat of your brow, not the ink on the page. The words hung in the air, specific enough to sting, general enough to be denied. They were different, and the world had no category for their kind of difference. Then, in the spring of 1878, Arthur caught a fever that burned through him in less than a week. He died on a Tuesday, his geology book stacked neatly by his bed. With him died the quiet buffer that had stood between Martha's sharp mind and the town's suspicion. The debts they had incurred for their books, their imported breeding ram, their strange equipment, they all came due. Sheriff Brody, a man whose own ranching failures were a source of local gossip, saw his opportunity. He was a major shareholder in the town bank that held the notes. He moved with a swiftness that felt less like law and more like vengeance. He declared the property forfeit against the debt, brushing aside Martha's protests that the ranch itself was worth 10 times the amount owed. He gave her 24 hours to vacate the premises. She was to take only what she could carry. The house, the herd, the life they had built from books and hard work, was no longer hers. The system had finally found a way to expel the foreign object in its midst. She packed no heirlooms, no portraits, no keepsakes from her former life. Sentiment was a luxury, a weight she could not afford to carry. In a burlap sack, she placed a small bag of flour, a tin of salt, a knife, a flint and steel, and Arthur's book on the geology of the Rocky Mountains. She took the book on animal husbandry in her hand. Then she walked to the small pen behind the barn, a place hidden from the main house. There waited the 3 ewes she had managed to drive away in the pre-dawn confusion. They were her best, the hardiest of the line she and Arthur had spent years developing. They were not just animals, they were living libraries of genetic knowledge. They were the future, if she could find a place to build one. She did not look back. To look back was to invite the poison of bitterness, and bitterness was another weight. She walked toward the Torridon peaks, the 3 ewes following with the placid trust of their kind. The townspeople watched her go from their windows. They saw a madwoman walking into a blizzard, a fitting end for someone who had always held herself apart. They saw a failure. Martha saw the only path left. The first 3 days were a study in the body's slow surrender to the cold. The wind was a constant, physical presence. It pushed against her, stole her breath, and worked its way into the very marrow of her bones. Her world shrank to the next step, and the one after that. The snow was not a soft blanket. It was a shifting, treacherous landscape that hid rocks and hollows, turning a simple mile into an exhausting ordeal. The ewes, with their thick wool and low centers of gravity, fared better than she did. They became her compass, their instincts guiding them to the shelter of rock outcroppings and dense thickets of pine where the wind was less severe. By the 4th day, the shivering began. At first, it was a good sign. It was the body's furnace, burning what little fuel it had left to generate heat. But it was a costly fire. It consumed her energy, leaving her dizzy and weak. Her fingers, which she kept tucked in her armpits for warmth, went from a burning ache to a numb white. They stopped reporting pain. They simply became objects at the ends of her arms, clumsy and useless. Her teeth ached from the constant, violent chattering. Moving required a conscious act of will, a deliberate command sent from a distant, foggy brain to limbs that no longer felt like her own. Crawling to the small stream to break the ice for water was a monumental effort. On the 5th night, she found a shallow overhang of rock that offered minimal protection from the driving snow. The ewes huddled together, their shared warmth creating a small pocket of life in the immense, indifferent cold. Martha lay beside them, her own body a cold stone. This, she thought, was where the story might end. The thought came without panic, a simple, logical conclusion. She could just close her eyes. She could let the snow drift over her. It would be a quiet death. She thought of the warm kitchen she had lost, the smell of baking bread, the simple comfort of a chair by the fire. For a moment, she considered turning back, walking down the mountain, and begging for a place in a barn, for the warm oatmeal she had always hated. She could trade her pride for survival. But something pulled her back from the edge. It was not a miracle. It was a sentence. A line she had read a dozen times in Arthur's geology book, underlined in his precise pencil script. The limestone formations of the Torridon Range are notable for their extensive karst topography, often resulting in significant subterranean systems and geothermal venting. Geothermal venting. Heat from inside the earth. It was a practical problem that demanded her attention. One of the ewes was shivering, a deep, rattling tremor that signaled the final stage before collapse. The animal's survival depended on her, and her survival depended on the animal. The body made a decision before the mind could argue. She had to get up. She forced herself to her knees, then to her feet. The dizziness was a black wave, but it passed. She looked out into the pre-dawn gloom, her eyes searching for a sign. Arthur had theorized that the warmer vents would betray themselves, even in the snow. They would create subtle microclimates, places where the snow was thinner, where hardy mosses might cling to the rock. She began to walk, not aimlessly, but with purpose. She scanned the base of the cliffs, ignoring the grand vistas, focusing on the small details. Hours passed. The sun was a weak, white disk in a grey sky, offering no warmth. Her hope was dwindling, turning into a cold, hard knot of despair in her gut. Then she saw it. A thin, almost invisible wisp of vapor rising from a fissure in a rock face about 50 yards away. It was no thicker than a thread, a ghostly exhalation from the mountain itself. It could have been a trick of the light, a figment of her desperate imagination. But as she drew closer, she saw that the snow around the fissure was melted away in a small, perfect circle. The rock itself was damp. The opening was small, almost completely obscured by a tangle of snow-dusted hawthorn bushes. It was a hole a person would have to crawl through. For a moment, she hesitated. The darkness within was absolute. But the air that breathed from it was not the frozen air of the mountain. It was cool, but not cold. It smelled of damp earth, of stone, and of something else, something ancient and alive. She pushed the ewes forward. They resisted at first, then, sensing the promise of shelter, they squeezed through the opening. Martha followed, crawling on her hands and knees into the unknown. The narrow passage continued for 10 feet, then opened up. She could not see the dimensions of the space she was in, but she could feel it. The air was vast. The sound of her own breathing no longer felt small and alone, it was swallowed by a great, silent emptiness. She lit a precious match. The flame flickered, then held steady, revealing a cavern of impossible scale. The ceiling was lost in darkness high above. The walls were a cascade of limestone formations, shaped by millennia of dripping water. And from the center of the cavern floor, a great pillar of rock rose to meet the unseen roof. But it was the air that was the miracle. It was a constant 55 degrees. A faint warmth radiated from the floor, just as Arthur's book had predicted. Along one wall, a steady stream of clear water trickled from a fissure, pooling in a natural stone basin before disappearing into another crack in the floor. It was a self-contained world, a secret kingdom hidden within the mountain's heart. She did not feel relief. Relief is a fleeting emotion, the release of tension. This was something deeper. This was recognition. She dropped to her knees and placed her bare hand flat against the warm stone floor. This was the place from Arthur's maps. This was the theory made real. She sat there on the floor of the great cavern, the darkness a comforting blanket, the 3 ewes huddled at her side, their shivering already subsiding. She had no word for the feeling, except right. The world of men had cast her out. The earth itself had taken her in. The first weeks underground were about mapping her new world. With a burning torch made from a branch and a strip of her own petticoat, she explored the cavern system. It was larger than she could have imagined. The main cavern, which she named the Great Hall, was the size of a cathedral. From it, several smaller passages led to other chambers. One passage sloped gently downward, opening into a series of lower caverns, their floors covered in rich, dark soil washed down from the surface over centuries. Another led to a high-ceilinged chamber with a wide, jagged fissure in its roof, a wound in the mountain that let in a column of pale, diffuse light for a few hours each day. This, she knew, would be her garden. Building her ranch was a slow, deliberate process of turning theory into practice. There were no sawmills, no hardware stores, only the raw materials of the cave and the knowledge in her head. Her tools were born of necessity. A flat, sharp-edged piece of shale, broken from a ledge, became her knife, her spade, her axe. She used it to cut the tough, wild grasses that grew in sheltered pockets near the cave entrance, dragging them inside to create dry bedding for the ewes. She fashioned a crude hammer by lashing a heavy, rounded stone to a sturdy branch with strips of leather cut from her own boots. Her first major project was containment. The lower caverns were perfect for the animals, naturally sheltered and warmer than the Great Hall. She used her shale knife and hammer to break apart fallen rock, painstakingly building low stone walls to create separate pens. It was brutal, exhausting work. Her hands, already raw from the cold, were now blistered and bleeding. But every stone she laid was a victory, a small piece of order imposed on the wildness of her surroundings. She found a large deposit of clay near the spring and, remembering a chapter in one of Arthur's books, began to fashion crude pots and bowls, leaving them to dry near a geothermal vent that emitted a steady, gentle heat. A cracked cast iron pot, salvaged from a long-abandoned trapper's lean-to she discovered a mile from the cave, became her most prized possession. It still held water if you were careful. The rhythms of her life were dictated by the needs of her animals and the slow, patient work of building. She milked the ewes, the warm, rich liquid a daily miracle. She learned the passages of her cavern system so well she could navigate them in the dark, her hands reading the texture of the walls. The isolation was a physical weight. Some days, the silence was so profound it felt like a pressure against her ears. In those moments, she would talk to the ewes, her voice a strange, rusty sound in the vast emptiness. She read her 2 books by firelight, the words a connection to a world that no longer existed for her. They were not just books, they were manuals for survival, the collected wisdom of mind she would never know. The first proof that this impossible life could work came in late January. One of her ewes gave birth to twin lambs. They were small but healthy, their coats thick, their cries sharp and demanding. Born in the dead of winter, in a cave deep inside a mountain, they were a defiant declaration of life. Martha held one of the lambs, its small body warm and trembling against her, and felt a crack in the wall of stoicism she had built around her heart. The second proof grew in the dark soil of the high chamber she called the sun room. She had hauled buckets of the rich cave soil and mixed it with guano from a colony of bats that roosted near the ceiling fissure. She planted the handful of potato eyes and heirloom lettuce seed she had carried in her pocket. In the dim, filtered light, they sprouted. The growth was slow, the plants pale, but they grew. The first head of lettuce she harvested was a ghostly white, but the leaves were crisp and sweet. She ate it slowly, leaf by leaf, the taste of it on her tongue more profound than any feast she had ever known. It was the taste of possibility. Her ally arrived not with a search party, but with a goat. Isaac was a young man from the valley, considered simple by the townsfolk because he rarely spoke and spent most of his time wandering the mountains. He was not simple, he was merely quiet, his language the language of tracks, of weather, of animal behavior. He had a preternatural gift with livestock, a calm that soothed the most skittish creatures. He had tracked one of his family's lost goats deep into the Torridons, a place others avoided. He found the entrance to Martha's cave not by sight, but by smell, the faint, unfamiliar scent of wood smoke and sheep where there should be none. He was not afraid. He peered into the darkness, his eyes wide with a quiet, uncomplicated curiosity. When Martha emerged, her face smudged with soot, a shale knife in her hand, he simply nodded. He looked past her, into the firelit cavern, at the healthy ewes and their lambs. He saw not a witch, but a rancher. He recognized the competence, the quiet order she had created. He pointed at the low stone wall. "Good," he said. It was the first word she had heard from another human in 4 months. Isaac became her bridge to the world, a willing conspirator in her secret existence. He never asked how she had come to be there. He simply accepted it. He began to visit once a week, bringing things he could trade for or take without being missed, a sack of salt, a new file for sharpening her shale knife, a handful of nails. In return, she gave him knowledge. She taught him how to treat a goat for lungworm using a specific type of lichen that grew in the cave. She showed him how the lambs born in the cave's constant temperature were healthier than those born in the valley's harsh spring. He listened, his silent attention a form of respect she had never known. It was Isaac who, in an attempt to help her, first revealed her existence to the valley. He took a small wheel of her goat cheese, wrapped in grape leaves he had gathered, to the general store. Mr. Gable, the storekeeper, was a man who prided himself on his skepticism. He unwrapped the cheese, his nose twitching. "Cheese this fresh?" In February, he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "Where'd you get this, boy?" Isaac just shrugged. Gable cut a small piece. He tasted it. His eyes widened. The flavor was undeniable, creamy, tangy, with a faint, clean mineral taste from the cave's unique terroir. He bought the whole wheel without another word. Soon, whispers started. The mountain boy was bringing in impossible things. Crisp radishes in March. Dried herbs that smelled like the peak of summer. The talk reached Preacher Davis, who warned his flock about unnatural harvests, of things grown without God's sun, hinting at dark forces at work in the mountains. The fear and suspicion that had driven Martha out now swirled around her ghostly presence. Then, that winter, a blizzard descended on the valley and did not relent for 3 weeks. It was a storm of historic proportions, burying fences and barns, isolating families in their homes. The cold was a relentless killer. Cattle, caught in open pasture, froze where they stood. The valley's hay reserves dwindled, then ran out. People were hungry. The skepticism about Isaac's goods vanished, replaced by desperate need. He would arrive in town with a sled laden with potatoes, cheese, and dried meat from Martha's cave, and it would be sold before he had even untied the ropes. People didn't ask questions anymore. They came for the food, their hunger overriding their fear. They did not come for the mountain woman. They came for what she produced. And in doing so, they unknowingly acknowledged the very knowledge they had once condemned. The valley was being saved by the woman it had thrown away. The following winter arrived with a different kind of cruelty. It was not a single, brutal storm, but a slow, grinding plague. A lung sickness swept through the valley's cattle herds, a pestilence born of weakened stock and the lingering hardship of the previous year. The herds that had survived the blizzard now fell to the disease. The air in the valley grew thick with the smell of burning carcasses. Wealth vanished. Hope withered. Sheriff Brody was hit the hardest. His prize-winning Hereford herd, the source of his wealth and his standing in the community, was wiped out in a month. He was a man hollowed out. The certainty he had worn like a suit of armor was gone, replaced by the stoop of defeat. He looked smaller than Martha remembered, the hardness in him gone soft and sagging. He had lost everything. It was Isaac who led him up the treacherous mountain path in the grey light of a December afternoon. Brody walked, his horse having been sold for feed weeks before. He stopped at the hawthorn-choked entrance to the cave, his breath misting in the cold air. He was a man come to the end of himself. When Martha appeared, he did not flinch. He looked at her, at the quiet competence in her eyes, the strength that seemed to radiate from her like the heat from the cave itself. He did not ask for forgiveness. His need was too great for such formalities. He asked for help. His family was down to their last sack of flour. The town was starving. The few remaining cattle were too weak to breed, even if they survived. He asked, his voice low and raspy, if she had any breeding stock to spare. He asked if she knew what was killing the cattle, if any of her books held an answer. Martha listened, her expression unreadable. She looked past him, to the vast, firelit space behind her, where healthy sheep moved in their stone pens, their bleating a sound of impossible vitality. She looked back at the diminished man who had taken everything from her. Her response was not emotional. It was logistical. How many families need feeding? She asked. They worked for hours, loading a sled Isaac had built with potatoes, wheels of cheese, and sacks of dried herbs. Then Martha led them to a separate cavern where she kept her small herd of goats and the new line of sheep she had been breeding. They were smaller than the valley's stock, but tough, bred for survival in the harsh conditions. She picked out 2 breeding pairs of sheep and a young, healthy billy goat. As they prepared to leave, Brody reached inside his coat. He pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper and held it out to her. It was the original deed to her land. This was never filed with the county, he said, not meeting her eyes. Arthur, he paid the debt the week before he passed. I held it. It was not an apology. It was a confession, a final, painful shedding of his pride. It was an admission that his actions had been born not of law, but of spite. Martha took the deed. She looked at the familiar signatures, the lines that had once defined her entire world. Then, she walked to a lantern hanging from a rock hook. She carefully folded the paper into a long, thin strip and used it as a taper, lighting it from the fire and touching the flame to the lantern's wick. The paper browned, curled, and caught fire, its brief, bright flare illuminating the cavern. "The paper is no good in the damp," she said, her voice even. "We need the light to see the trail." Martha never moved back to the valley. The cave was her home, the ranch her life's work. The deed was ash. But the valley began to come to her. First, a few desperate ranchers, then more, came to trade for her hardy breeding stock. They came with questions about the cattle plague, and she opened her books, sharing the knowledge of quarantine and herbal remedies that helped them save what little they had left. She taught them, without judgment, what she had learned about soil and water and life. She never spoke of the past. She only dealt with the practical problems of the present. Decades passed. The underground ranch became a quiet legend, a place of learning. Martha grew old, her face a map of the years, her hands gnarled but still capable. She died on a spring afternoon, sitting in a chair she had fashioned from smooth stone and woven wool, one of Arthur's geology books open in her lap. The air in the cavern was warm. From the lower chambers came the gentle, echoing sounds of healthy animals, a testament to a life of quiet, relentless creation. Isaac's grandson, a young man with his grandfather's quiet way with animals, was tending the flock. She looked like a person who had just finished a long and satisfying book. Her legacy was not written in stone, but in life. The methods of sheltered animal husbandry she developed saved the valley's economy. The Torridon Red, a hardy potato strain she cultivated in her sunless garden, became a staple crop for 3 generations, feeding hundreds of families. The community, once so quick to judge, remembered her with a kind of reverence. Isaac carved a simple inscription on a flat stone and placed it near the cave entrance. It read, "Martha. She built down to grow up. You have a place the world told you was worthless. A cave of strange knowledge, a dismissed skill, a quiet love nobody understood. You have been standing at the entrance for years, afraid of the dark, afraid of the isolation. You have been listening to the voices that told you nothing could grow there. What if the warmth you have been looking for is not out in the sun, where everyone else is looking? What if it is deep within the ground nobody else thought to look?" That small, warm rock in her pocket was not a talisman. It was a piece of data. The world punishes you for what you know, until it needs what you can build. If stories of quiet resilience are why you are here, subscribe for more. We travel next to the coast of Maine, to a woman who built a lighthouse with her bare hands.